welcome to our third and last encounter of the Institutional Gender Analysis Workshop. Yes, hope you're enjoying so far, and we'll do also today. So a brief summary of our topics. We will do, make a short introduction. I will recap a bit of the topics that we covered last week, since it was 1 week, and just to refresh what we were talking about. Then we will give room for reviewing the homework that you had. Some of you managed to complete. I think we have 4 participants who managed to complete. We will open the discussion here because we will have plenty of time. And yes, I will also share a couple of examples from the institutional analysis that I run in my organization. And then 2 other sessions basically devoted to, okay, what next? Karim will take care of explaining you how to enter the phase of JEP design. And I will be taking over the topic of monitoring. Some key learning points of last session to refresh our minds. We touched upon 3 main topics. The last one, according to my slide, unfortunately, I didn't put it in purple, but these are 3. The purple ones are the 3 topics. The first one was about the importance of having a high quality data management system in place in your institution. I think both Karim and I highlighted too many times maybe that no assessment can be done without sex disaggregated data. And the higher the quality of this data, the more precise the analysis will be. But without data, we're going literally nowhere. This doesn't mean that we're not going to have gaps in data. That's totally, for sure, totally be the case for all of us. But we need data as a starting point, at least one type of data to analyze a couple of indicators. We covered the importance of all the stages of data, not only the collection of data, also where is this data stored and in which shape that storage is. And a third component that is also key is we might have fantastic collection and very secure and organized storage, but if we don't have access to that, then we're also grilled. So it's very important to know whose door we have to knock on to access the data that we need. And for the analysis of this data, Karim mentioned the importance of the protecting identities of the individuals to keep confidentiality of the data that we collect and analyze. And I will be touching also upon this topic a bit later when I discuss how to communicate results. The second big point was about data collection for the analysis of indicators. So first of all, identify what are our data requirements for measuring the indicators that we have developed. Identify the data providers. This is related to the access topic that I just mentioned. Who is the one that has the data that we need for calculating indicators? And also detect the availability. Is this data there? And if there are data gaps for some calculations, then the data gaps should be included in the JEP as an objective. So collecting data, certain type of data that is not there is as well part of our future JEP. Bear in mind that more than one type of data might be required for calculating an indicator. We might have quantitative data, qualitative data, and hybrid type of data for your quantitative, qualitative, and hybrid type of indicators. And the third topic that we touched upon, which is not in purple here, is the methodologies for calculating and analyzing data. And basically, we touched upon quantitative methods of analysis, collecting and analyzing data. The quantitative is mostly about statistical analysis, and the qualitative is about mostly surveys, questionnaires, interviews, focus groups. You can also have case studies, policy analysis / policy quality impact assessment that Karim explained so thoroughly. And once again, bear in mind that we might need more than one methodology at the same time to analyze one particular indicator. What, where, and how to present the results of your audit, and give some tips and tricks from my experience and from several suggestions given also by the GEAR tool, and then open the floor for questions, and also Karim, any additions that you would like to make. So what we have to decide about what, where, and how to present is, first of all, in terms of format. So how we're going to put that data in terms of visualization, how we're going to present in terms of strategy. And here I will touch upon the topics of strategic framing, adapting the message for different audiences, and presenting in different fora in your university, in your institution. And also I'm going to discuss a bit of terms in terms of safe outputs that Karim already mentioned in the last session, but I'm going to also repeat a little bit of this because it connects directly with presenting results. So first suggestion I would make is do not overwhelm the audience or audiences. Of course, this can be, it very much depends on the size of the institution and on how thorough your audit was, but you can end up with a 100-pagers document, baseline assessment. At least that was our case. Nobody in the world with this, except for you and friends and family, but I cannot see, nobody's going to read that, all of it. The reports themselves carry a lot of chapters. You will explain there your context of your university, background information, which data you used, how you access to this data, was a bit of the institutional context. We had a lot of that at CU because we were in the middle of moving from another country. You will have also annexes, and I would totally encourage you to use the annexes of the report to put their transcripts of interviews, case studies, surveys, questionnaires. So leave all of that out of the body of the report. Again, these are suggestions in case you have a similar experience than we did with a 100-page report. So of course, it's very important to have the long version of the document to which anybody can go and check if they have doubts with how you reach that conclusion or that result. So of course, it's important to have that, but then it's important to explore different formats of communications, because otherwise people will get easily lost in the details and lose the whole picture of it. And of course, the interest as well. After the 50th page, then nobody will be able to know what they're reading anymore. So is in this exploring different formats for different audiences, I have a couple of examples. I found that executive summaries for high leadership work very well. Executive summaries are generally a 5-pager at most, in which you put the results of the audit and you use another page with conclusions and recommendations for actions. And generally, high leadership will be inclined to read much more an executive summary than the entire report. For students, you might have brochures with infographics, tables, and more visual content that you can distribute around campus when COVID is over. And also I encourage you to put together PPT presentations in case you manage to have the opportunity to present results individually by department, and you tailor that PPT to the different departments, highlighting information and results you got from that particular department or research centers. So that was definitely our case. We took the presentation to different audiences and we were tailoring the presentation to focus on what was going to be relevant for our audience. And this means that you have 15 versions of the same PPT. So some ideas on how to visualize data. I'm not going to say, there's nothing revolutionary on what I'm going to say, but just some examples. Infographics, for example, are getting more and more popular. I think they're a very nice way of visualizing data, in the case of data being quantitative, of course, and results being quantitative. I give you an example here on the average number of speakers in events. So I think it was Magdalena mentioning this indicator. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Oh, no, it was not Magdalena. I think it was maybe Fernanda mentioning this. So we basically took all of the events and measured by hand how many women and men were participating in those events. And we came to this conclusion that the average of each event are 4 speakers, and 1.5 of those are women, 2.5 are men. Of course, we all understand that people don't come in halves, but generally it's a very way to illustrate and to highlight the differences in gender distribution of speakers in an event. Another type of graph, this column is very simple. Of course, you know what this is about, but it's a very fast way for people to understand what we're saying and to visualize what we're saying. In this case, the percentages of female and male professors per rank in our university. Women are in purple, men are in orange, and you can see the quite disastrous profile of our social sciences and humanities oriented university. The higher the rank, the lower the percentage of women in the rank. Another graph that we put together is this linear graph. This is very interesting because it allows you to show the historical, so a historical point of view, progression on different numbers. And in this case was a historical indicator about the gender composition of the Senate, which is one of our main decision-making bodies in the university. And we took this period. We took this period because there was no other data before that. So this is what we had. And you can see, of course, men were always in majority, but the last election was particularly bad in terms of gender equality. So the key takeaways that I want to address here for you on the topic of communication is that you should use the results of this institutional gender analysis as a strategic document, and don't present everything at the same time. Just choose the priorities that you believe are most important at the moment of communicating results. If you go area by area with a zillion indicators by area, then you probably are going, so the audience will be left with nothing in their heads. So strategic framing, again, is a topic on its own and would deserve an entire workshop, but it's basically about the fact that different groups and different stakeholders in your institution have different agendas, different interests, and different goals. So all stakeholders have an agenda. And this agenda is not always evident. Sometimes it's hidden agenda, and it's nevertheless possible to know because you have institutional knowledge. So for a better reception of the results and recommendations, always try to align your presentation with those interests and trying to emphasize those in your communication. So basically your results, how they would help each constituency to advance also their own agenda. And another recommendation is just try to present your results in all possible fora that is available. In my institution, we have several of those: academic forums, Senate, town hall meetings, because frequent communication is definitely key to keep the topic of gender equality on the agenda. So basically there is impossible not to see that gender work is going on in the institution. And another final hope panel on my side for this section is safe outputs. Karim mentioned this in much more detail, so I'm going to just refresh that. So at the moment of communicating results, there's a very specific thing that you have to bear in mind, which is called SDC, the Statistical Disclosure Control. I took this slide from Professor Anne-Laure Humbert, who is also part of Gender Academy. She gave me her explicit consent to use this slide. She's an expert in statistics and in terms of disclosure control. And it's important to, when you present results, before presenting the results, to address if there's risk of disclosure. So basically, if there's a risk of violating the confidentiality protection of sensitive data of individuals. So look at your data, check if there are any risks of disclosure, and if so, just remove the data from there, not from your records, but from the communication presentations, or use some statistical techniques that would avoid disclosure. So for example, if you have only 1 or 2 people at one rank, and you're talking about salaries, then it's much better if you could merge those 2 people with another, the second higher rank, and present the results like this. So you avoid any sort of disclosure. All of the risk, as also Karim mentioned, can mostly when we have small counts. So when we have a very small sample, either overall or per rank, for example. And this is especially important when you're when you're incorporating intersectional variables, because the count gets smaller and smaller. And I'm just going to give you an example of this, which is the mean salaries. This is a totally, this is an intersectional approach. In this case, it's not divided by gender, but we of course had the data, but this only serves the purposes of showing you the risks of disclosure. So we have the mean salaries here by nationality. I erased the numbers. It's not relevant. We know the numbers, but it's not relevant. And you can see here something that it totally reflects the world power dynamics, the global power dynamics. The higher salaries go for North America, EU, Western Europe, and UK, and then Oceania, Latin America, Asia, Eastern Europe, MENA region, former USSR, EU, Eastern Europe, and Africa, they go downwards. But if you look here on the right-hand side, hopefully you can see it, I wrote here the headcounts for each region. So we are not even talking about nationality. This is an error here. We're talking what we did to avoid disclosure of personal data. We didn't even go by nationality, but we clustered nationalities in a way that it made sense from a geopolitical point of view. So we cluster all of those nationalities into these regions. And if you look at the headcount here, you will probably see that we have 2 problematic numbers. One of them is the employees from Oceania, and the other one, even worse, is that we only have 1 employee coming from Africa. So what happens here is quite obvious. You will totally be disclosing that the salary of these 2 people is here, and that the salary of the only African person or employee is the absolute worst. So everybody will know who that person is. It's absolutely identifiable. And everybody will know, even though here we don't have numbers, everybody will know that this is the worst paid person in the organization. So be careful with that. Also, Karim mentioned it in the last session, numbers below 10 are particularly problematic. Of course, it depends on the size of your organization, but they are particularly problematic. So this is all that I had to share with you.
Thank you, Anna, for that very comprehensive coverage on communicating the audit results. Just want to mention and just give a few reflections on what you said at the very beginning about that importance of having a different communication approach for different stakeholders within your organization. And my recommendation for you is to think about an engagement plan when you're developing your communication approach. So engagement at these different levels is really going to be very tailored to their needs and their priorities. So not everybody wants or is able to attend open sessions or meetings or read big long reports that are 50+ pages. So thinking about creatively using social media, for example, creatively using video content, creatively using newsletters, having a quarterly update on staff development or researcher development, using other types of mechanisms that already exist. So for example, you might have a monthly research newsletter. So in that newsletter, you might present some results about the key action area to do with mainstreaming gender in research and teaching and so forth. So you're using existing opportunities that are creative in order to disseminate the information, but also giving the results of the audit a more real life and tangible importance and not something that's just abstract. That's all I wanted to say on that. Okay, so I thought we would recap with where we are in the gender mainstreaming cycle. So with the gender analysis, we were in the define stage where we were using different methods and tools in order to identify data and to find out what the state of play within the organization is. And we've moved on to the planning phase by actually developing gender indicators. And now it's time to start designing a gender equality plan. So we're moving through this gender mainstreaming cycle. And it is a cycle because you're always improving, going back into that analysis and assessment phase. Once you've done your plan, implemented some actions, you're monitoring the progress, but then you're going back into it to make sure you are continuously improving. But as we go from gender analysis to JEP design, we need to be aware of a few things. Firstly, the process of gender analysis was quite a structured process. We were looking at data sources, looking at indicators, creating lists of where the data is from, where the stakeholders are that we need to interact with to get that data, and what methods we'll use to measure the indicators. As we move towards JEP design, it becomes a bit less structured. We're having to deal with priorities, with leadership, and with different real life situations that are unique to your organization. So for example, there might be other more pressing issues that are causing upheaval within your institution that are preventing it from moving forward, such as strikes or leadership changes that are causing a lot of uncertainty. So some of those items might actually have a bearing on your gender equality plan. And so as we move through this process, there will be priorities for areas of intervention that your gender analysis has highlighted, and also data gaps that need to be filled in order for a more holistic view of the gender state of play within your organization is. And then I mentioned earlier that leadership involvement in developing the JEP because your gender equality plan will only be successful if you have that buy-in. And so the different stakeholders within your organization will influence that development phase. I also mentioned the participatory techniques in the last workshop that need to be used in order for the design of your JEP to be successful, but also for the implementation, because when you have the buy-in of your different audiences in that development phase, you can really tailor your actions so that they are most suited to the particular context, but also the actions that have been identified resonate with the community within your particular university or research institutes. Then there's the question of what are the indicators that you want to improve? And that goes back to what I started with about the priority areas. So which indicators do you want to improve, and how are you going to measure that improvement? Do you have a target? So that's really important as well. And we'll talk about that in more detail as we think about SMART objectives. So I'm sure all of you have heard of SMART objectives. Just a quick recap. SMART objectives are those that are specific. And what we mean by that is that they can answer questions of what, why, how, who, when, and where. A very specific objective will cover all that information, and it has to be measurable. So you need to have indicators and targets. We've talked about that in the context of a gender analysis, but an objective as well has to have indicators and targets to know whether that has been met. It has to be achievable, and that means that it has to actually be feasible to do. You can have ambitious targets, and those are very good, but it shouldn't be completely out of reach. Realistic as well, meaning that it is relevant for your organization and that it can be achieved within the period of time that you've specified. And of course, time bound, meaning that you've set a date and a timeline in order to meet that particular objective. And so we'll take a look at how this gets implemented in real life examples. But of course, since we are designing gender equality plans, it's useful to remember what the definition is. So this is a definition from the European Commission. And what they're saying is that gender equality plans have an impact assessment or audit of procedures and practices that identify gender bias, and you implement strategies to correct that bias, and you set targets and monitor progress via indicators. So this is one definition of a gender equality plan. You could find some others that are less comprehensive and perhaps a bit more high level, but in general, this is what a plan has. So you need to have conducted some sort of assessment, you need to implement strategies to correct any biases, and you need to monitor the progress by setting targets and using indicators to measure that change. So perhaps you have a question, which is, what is the template that should be used for a gender equality plan? And the very simple answer is that there are many templates available out there. And the important thing here is to use a structure that works for your organization and that it covers the principles that we talked about in terms of SMART objectives. And we're going to take a look at an example in a couple of minutes. And I think Anna will also share a real life example from her organization.
Correct.
So, excellent. So some general principles, though, please do not simply copy and paste another gender equality plan. That is not a good practice. You can use them for inspiration, and you might identify similar issues, but it is not good to just take another organization's gender equality plan and say, oh, this is good, we'll just do exactly the same. It needs to be really adapted and tailored to your organization in order for the implementation to be successful. And key to this is to think about it as a change process, not as a tick box exercise, because if you think about it as a tick box exercise, then your implementation will be very procedural and it won't actually create sustainable change on the ground. And what we're aiming for is sustainable practice change. And so it really needs to be tailored to your organizational context, and it should have broad buy-in from your different stakeholders. And so before we move on to some concrete examples, I wanted to share with you this wheel. This is from the Horizon project called Systemic Action for Gender Equality, SAGE. They have produced this wheel, and it covers 4 out of the 5 key areas that we've been discussing. I thought I would share it with you because you can use it for inspiration when it comes to developing your gender equality plan, because it gives some ideas on the types of areas that could be used and targeted within your plan. So for example, under career progression and professional development, you have tailored mentoring, you have gender balanced visiting professors, etc. You have policies for work-life balance in your left-hand quadrant, and there's different ideas there in terms of changing the culture within your institution. So this is a very, very useful resource, and I can suggest to you that on from a number of EU-funded projects, there are some very useful outputs, some examples of gender equality plans, and this particular project has also developed an online module that you might find interesting. So that's something to look at as well. So what I wanted to do is take you through an example of JEP and just discuss it with you. So for the key area, work-life balance and organizational culture, we've taken just one issue, one objective, and that's an issue to review support for carers and flexible working arrangements. And we've chosen 2 indicators here: level of satisfaction with current policies and processes, and availability of adequate policies and processes to support staff with caring responsibilities. And the planned action was to have focus groups with staff. And the reason is that in this particular example, actually, there are already mechanisms, there's already a policy, but we want to understand how can this be improved and what is the best way to find out. So we've decided to have focus groups, and we decided to have an analysis of those focus groups completed by the 1st of September 2022. The human resources director is the person responsible for this. We've decided to have 3 focus groups that we want to have by the end of July, and then have a report with the findings by the 1st of September. And the outputs and outcomes from this are a report and actions for policy improvement. So this is an example of what you could do in your own context. What is important here is that you have the elements of SMART. The objective is very specific. It's measurable because you can say whether or not you've conducted the focus groups. We have a quantity here, 3 focus groups. So if you've only done 1, you can measure your progress. It's achievable because we have a whole year to produce this particular output. And we have a very realistic goal of just having 3 focus groups. So you could have 1 a quarter, and you also have sufficient time in order to prepare your report with the findings, because after each session, you're going to do your own analysis anyway. And then after the final report, you have a month. After the final focus group, you have a month to prepare and collate everything together. And your outcome from that, your output from that is your report, and you have actions for policy improvement based on those focus groups. So that's just one option. And there might be alternatives for your organization, but as you can see, it has the SMART elements in it, and it gives you something concrete that can be achieved. What I would say here is that for your own plan for internal purposes, obviously you would need to discuss each objective with the person and department responsible, and actually have a named contact of who is going to be doing that work and responsible for ensuring that it gets completed. So your human resources director might not actually be doing the focus groups, but they are responsible for making sure that they happen. They will probably delegate that task to one of their employees within their team. So Anna, do you have any comments on this, or shall I continue?
Please go on, looks fantastic.
So for the next key action area, this is about gender balance and leadership and decision making. And the issue that we want to address here is to monitor gender ratio at all staff grades and in decision making positions. So this is two different things. One, it's about all staff grades, and two, it's about decision making positions. And our indicator is a gender distribution across different staff pay levels and decision-making positions. And what we've chosen to do here is actually more of a process fix, because at the moment, the gender monitoring is quite complex, and it's not very easy to do. So what we want to do is upgrade the human resources staff database to enable disaggregated reporting to record membership of institutional committees and decision-making bodies. And we want to make sure that our policies and processes are aligned to that, so that when people are appointed to those positions, it is formally documented by the Human Resources Department in the database so that we can do the reporting on it. And so this involves a number of different departments. In my case, an IT service department, because they're the ones responsible for the staff database, the Human Resources Department, and then we have a lovely department called Policy Planning and Governance, and they're responsible for policies and procedures and planning, as the name suggests. So they like bureaucracy, and they make sure that processes can be created in order to capture this new way of doing things. And so our measures of success is a database that can produce disaggregated reports by staff pay level and membership of decision-making bodies, and that the staff and personnel record reflects the contribution to university committees. So it's not just about being an associate professor in a department, but also they might be members of the ethics committee, or they might have other committee responsibilities, and so they're contributing to the wider aims and objectives of the organization, but not necessarily through core academic work of research and teaching. And so the outputs here and your outcomes are increased reporting capabilities and a staff database that supports strategic priorities. So this is one example of an objective that could be put in. And again, you'll notice that this is about creating a sustainable platform so that you can make your analysis and ongoing monitoring more straightforward. Were there any comments on this, Anna, or can I move on?
Please move on. Yes.
Okay, so here we have another example from key action area number 3, which is about gender equality in recruitment, career progression, and retention. And here we've chosen to look at the retention rate for women returning to work following parental leave. So the indicator we've chosen here is the proportion of employees returning following paid parental leave as dictated by law or organizational policy, whichever is higher, disaggregated by gender. So what this means is someone who's gone off on parental leave and they've taken the full maximum period available to them, available by law, or if it's higher, provided by your institution, and they have come back or not have, or they haven't come back. So that's what we want to understand, that retention rate. And so our planned action was to do a survey before and after taking their parental leave. So that's important for those who have come back. If they haven't come back, then it's important that we have exit questionnaires for staff that leave the organization, and that's for all staff anyway, to include specific questions related to parental leave. And so what we want to do is implement pre and post parental leave surveys and we want to implement revised exit questionnaires by the 15th of October this year. The person and department responsible we've identified as Human Resources Director and the Gender Equality Officer, and the measures of success are to implement these surveys for pre and post parental leave, and to implement revised questionnaires for the exit questionnaires that are available to everyone. And that will give us an improved understanding of challenges in organizational culture, and it will provide systematic data collection on views and perceptions of departing staff. So we can use that in order to improve that retention rate, because obviously we know that when women take parental leave, quite often they don't return back to employment in the short term. Anna, did you have anything that you wanted to add here?
No, not really. I'm seeing the planned action. Yes, I'm nothing to add. Thank you.
And I just want to emphasize that these are specific actions for a specific context, and it's not, it might be that in your organization, you have a different set of priorities for this. It might be that you already have a very good retention rate, and it might be that this is not a priority action for you. So this is, again, it's important to remember the tailored nature of these things. For the integration of a gender dimension in research and teaching content, we wanted to look at the gender ratio of principal investigators, and our indicator is the percentage of principal investigators on externally funded grants disaggregated by gender. And our actions to improve this ratio were to offer training opportunities aimed at female researchers and create a mentoring program for women. And so we want to have some events, we want to launch a mentoring program, and the person responsible for all of this is the researcher development manager, and part of the research development unit. So they're going to take responsibility for this. And what our indicators for the objective itself to make sure that these have happened are 4 training events. So we're talking about 1 per quarter with a minimum of 80 attendees in total. And that we want a mentoring program that has at least 10 mentors identified and at least 20 expressions of interest from mentees who want to be mentored. And so that will give us as an outcome an improved gender ratio in research leadership positions, and it will create peer-to-peer support for career development. So some of these things are actually more to do with the culture and the environment in which you support your researchers and make it more inclusive. So some of these events, if you will create the right type of atmosphere in which you can promote gender inclusion. Anna, did you have anything to add, or shall I move on?
Same, all good. Perfect, very thorough, thank you.
Excellent. So here on the final key action area for gender-based violence, including sexual harassment, what we've been interested in doing is to appoint dedicated support staff to deal with gender-based violence and sexual harassment. And so our indicator is resources dedicated to prevention and monitoring of gender-based violence. And what we want to do is basically develop a job description, recruit new staff for a new position called Staff Welfare Officer, and review and amend the relevant policies and processes to make specific references to the Staff Welfare Officer. And we have timescales for that. Again, different departments have been identified, and our measure of success is to have this new position created, that it's filled by a suitably qualified individual, and that we have relevant policies amended. And our output is that we have additional resources for staff welfare. So this is just one example. Your plan might look different. And what's useful to note here is that your template that you use in your organization might be one that is already used for other planning purposes. So you might have other strategic plans that have objectives, measures, timescales, and the assigned individual or department for the progress. It might look different and it might have it in a different order, but what's important is that it captures some of the elements of SMART at least, and that you can measure the progress towards the achievement of your goal. Anna, any comments on this one, or are we good?
We can move on, totally. This is just me showing you how our gender equality plan looks like, only for one key action area, where we set the objective, the actions, and the timeline, and how we actually take it in my institution. This is not applicable for everybody. Could you show the next slide, Karim, since you have the control? We have two different documents. One is a gender equality plan that it aims for three years. So it covers 3 years, in our case, 2019, 2022. And then we have this other document that is called work plan that we do each and every year, which much more detailed indicators, responsibility, and resources. So from the actions that we had in the JEP, we take them one by one, and we specify which are the indicators that will show us that there was progress. And also very important, assigning responsibility and checking whether we have enough budget in financial and also human resources. So it was basically to show you how this looks. So one possible format and visualization of it. And that's pretty much it. It was there as an example. The JEP of my university is public online. So of course you can check it. You can check it online. Okay, then I continue with the part 2 of what next, from actions to monitoring. Once again, this is not going to be in a lot of depth because it's not the specific topic of our training today, but I will try to show you a bit of how monitoring and evaluation are a key part of the process of gender mainstreaming and change. So one definition of monitoring is that monitoring is the continuous function of using systematic data collection on specific indicators to assess the extent of progress in achieving set objectives. These set objectives come generally in the way of JEP targets. So what you have defined as a target in your JEP. The monitoring instruments that we will use are there to support effective actions, because when you know that you will have a monitoring, you basically try to, and all stakeholders try to be as effective as possible in the implementation of actions. It also creates accountability because responsibilities are divided and assigned, and it will also create accountability on the side of high leadership. If they endorse the gender equality plan and they do not act on it, then they will have to explain why this hasn't happened. And the monitoring also helps us identifying obstacles, blockages, and resistances. So if we realize that one action was not taken or was a very difficult action to implement, then we will have a better information on what resistances in our institution are. So I come here a little bit, I come here back because one idea that I forgot to mention is that without monitoring instruments, it is not possible to assess whether the organization is improving in terms of gender equality, and also the lack of monitoring will reduce the commitment of the stakeholders towards the implementation of the JEP. So if you have a JEP that is lacking monitoring instruments, then your efficiency is going to decline, and the commitment of your stakeholders to implement those actions will also decline. So what should be done in monitoring? First of all, check at regular intervals whether or to what degree the activities outlined in your JEP have been implemented and whether the predefined objectives and goals have been reached. How often this monitoring exercise has to be done? That very much depends on the size of your organization and on the resources that you have to carry this monitoring. Bear in mind that this monitoring mirrors a lot your institutional gender analysis, and that can be extremely time consuming, depending on how thorough you want to be. So the regular intervals have to be decided upon on realistic terms, in the sense of the human resources that you will find to conduct this analysis. And not only that, some other indicators and measures of progress and sort of indicators of progress do not make sense to analyze that or to monitor that in too short of a time. So if one of your objectives is related to, for example, institutional culture, a change in institutional culture, let's say vis-a-vis non-binary gender identities, it's not even recommended to monitor that indicator very soon, because institutional culture change takes a lot of time to occur. Whereas, for example, other indicators like gender pay gap, you can absolutely monitor that yearly, and should be an easy exercise to do. Doesn't mean that it is, but it should be if you have the adequate data and access to that data. So here the takeaway is the regular intervals are something that you have to decide with your team in terms of feasibility and in terms of how sense it makes for each indicator to be monitored at with certain frequency. So basically what we're looking at during the monitoring is, were the actions that were planned implemented? Was the strategy useful? If not, if the actions were not implemented, why not? Which were the resistances? Which were the obstacles? And if they were implemented, were the actions effective in tackling the problem? And to what extent? So the first one is a yes/no question, and the next one is more about how much this action actually helped. And of course, this monitoring is done by regular reporting, surveys, or other methods, which are most likely very similar, if not identical, to the ones that you used for institutional gender analysis. And of course, also relies on the quality of indicators developed in your audit phase. So if you had clear indicators and clear indicators and smart objectives, it's going to be much easier to monitor and to have accurate sense of progress. If your indicators were too loose and the goals were not smart, then it's going to be difficult to say if the action had an actual impact on the problem that you wanted to tackle. So you can conceive monitoring as basically a follow-up of the institutional regular assessment that is done at regular intervals. Monitoring encourages self-reflexivity, especially if this is a participatory exercise, which I very much encourage you to do. So if you have a team of people taking care of the monitoring, then these people will be able to reflect on what they have done and what they haven't done, and the quality of the implementation of the actions. So it's a moment of self-reflection. And of course, as I said before, monitoring is context sensitive. So pay attention to your resources, especially the human resources that you will need to conduct monitoring at the moment of deciding how regularly you're going to measure your indicators. And also plan the monitoring ahead. So you should integrate monitoring efforts already in your gender equality plan and attach responsibilities to that. So one section of your key action area of your gender equality plan should include what instrument this is going to be used to monitor the progress of that indicator from the very start. So you and the entire institution know that resources for this have to be allocated and factored in. And an obvious thing, both quantitative and qualitative indicators should be monitored. And also my suggestion here, and I don't know, Karim, if you agree, beware that you will have to monitor not only the indicators that you had problems with, or you have problems where your assessment showed that there were gender inequalities, because your assessment sometimes is a snapshot of the moment where you do it. Let's say the easier one, gender equality gap, and we might not have a gender equality gap in salaries in 2018, but we might have one in 2020. So the fact that something showed in our audit to be okay in terms of gender equality doesn't mean that this cannot deteriorate next year, the year after. So keep in mind that also things that were working well and were assessed as working properly might deteriorate, and regular monitoring of those indicators is also important and useful. I give the word to Karim.
Just very briefly, I completely agree. And actually, there's a very nice reason to monitor indicators that are performing well as well. Basically, if you have something positive that you can celebrate, it helps to motivate your senior leadership and also your community, because you have positive results to show as well. So if you have areas of good practice and areas where actually your indicators are better than the sector average or leading the sector, or even, you know, just it's highlighting a very positive results, it can help. It can really help motivate your colleagues. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yes, absolutely. I think my next slide might contain something regarding that, about how important it is also to communicate good results of the audit, and communicate even small successes, because many times leadership or the institution in general are feel quite threatened by the audit, because it will bring about loads of criticism in the way that the institution is doing things. So if we also show how well we're doing in other aspects, it will help bring a balance in the perception of the institution. The leadership or other stakeholders won't feel so threatened, because they will also have positive feedback on what they're doing. And this is going to bring about much more motivation than us picturing a very bleak, us showing a very bleak picture of what an institution is and what are all the gaps and problems that we have. So what comes after monitoring results, monitoring indicators? First of all, our results of the monitoring will inform us which are the steps that we need to take next. If the goal is reached, then fantastic. If it's not, shall we adjust the goal? Maybe we realize we've been too ambitious on what we wanted to achieve in terms of numbers, in terms of time frame. Shall we adjust the strategy that we had chosen to implement action? Maybe we chose to work with stakeholders who proved to be not that reliable or not to have such decision-making power as we thought they would. So maybe sometimes the goal hasn't been achieved, not because it was too ambitious, but rather because we worked with the wrong stakeholders. And another question is, should we change priorities? Maybe we had chosen an area to work on that was too difficult as a first step. And this is something that we have to bear in mind. When choosing priorities, it's important to have a balance between actions that we perceive and predict that will bring about success and change very soon, and they will be easy to implement, and those actions that we know are going to be much more challenging. So it's an important thing in your JEP to have a balance between what we think are going to be easily achievable targets and the difficult measures. If we have too many of those difficult measures considered as priorities, then we might have a lot of problems reaching those goals, and it's going to be very, so it's going to be have a very negative impact in our motivation to continue. We're going to burn out. So basically, when the goal is not reached or only partially, you will have to redesign your JEP. And the circle that Karim showed before, and I shared with you on the first day, starts again. So monitoring is not the last step. This is a circle. And after the monitoring, once we detect gaps in the implementation of actions and in the reaching of the goals, then we come back to our JEP and readapt and redesign, and the circle starts again. The results of the monitoring will help us push for action. If there was resistance to action, I want to share one example from my institution. We saw that our Senate was gender imbalanced, and we proposed to adopt a quota, a gender neutral quota for it. There was a lot of resistance, and this measure didn't pass. It was not accepted. And what happened is that next year, the Senate, the gender distribution in the Senate was horrific. So it was even worse than the year before. So when we monitor this, when we monitor the changes in the gender distribution of Senate members, and we could show to leadership that the situation deteriorated even more, then there's higher chances that they will accept in this case, the quota strategy that we suggested. So the results of monitoring, if they're positive, they will encourage people to move forward and it will increase the motivation. If they are not so positive or really bad, then we will have another argument to push for action. So this is a bit of a repetition, but this monitoring will help us push for stronger measures if the results were too weak, too slow, or inexistent. So zero change occurred. And celebrating change, as Karim also mentioned, and make the institution take pride in the change, if the goal is achieved, will increase the motivation and the commitment from stakeholders. So it's always, sometimes it takes a lot of effort and to implement a measure in the organization, and you face loads of resistances. But if you can show improvement, then everybody likes to take pride in it, and that will push people forward for more change.
So I just wanted to do a bit of a recap on the last few days very briefly. So we started by looking at the strategic need for a gender analysis as a method of finding out the state of play in the organization. We looked at how to decide on indicators and identify different data sources. And we also discussed the methods for measuring indicators, qualitative and quantitative, and the need for having targets. And today we covered the introduction to starting the process towards creating a gender equality plan, the need for SMART goals that are tailored to your organization. And we also discussed the communication of the results of your gender analysis. But one of the things that also we hope we emphasized was the need to have an intersectional perspective, and one that is participatory, where you engage different stakeholders when you're doing your analysis and your gender equality plan development. So that's really important to get a diverse range of views, because that will also inform the planned activities as part of your gender equality action plan. And so if we think about the journey so far, we talked about collecting data and information. We spoke a lot about indicators. We also discussed the barriers and some of the challenges. We talked about collaborating with others in terms of getting information, but also in terms of using participatory techniques in order to engage these stakeholders. Today, we discussed the communication of results, and we also discussed that there are often information gaps in order to that need to be addressed, basically. We covered SMART objectives today, and we talked about the need to monitor the indicators and analyze them.